Hello and welcome to our first Suffolk Western Front Association quarantine special. And who would have thought just 1 month ago, when we had our last meeting at Stowmarket Royal British Legion, that a month later we would all be stuck in our own homes, quarantined in lockdown for goodness knows how long. So we thought what we ought to do is to do something every month to keep the branch spirit going, to have a, if you like, a virtual meeting from the comfort of your own homes, where we have a talk so really just something just to keep you entertained while this crisis is going on. And what we thought to begin with, we would start just with a short talk, very similar to the Suffolk cameos that we do at Christmas at the AGM meeting. So just a sort of a 10 to 15 minute talk, really just to test the technology, make sure it all works. And if it does, then next time we'll do something a bit longer. So just to start with, I'd like to welcome you all you Suffolk Western Front Association members and all those of the other branches locally who also join into with our other sort of local events, and also to all of you who are not Western Front Association members at all, who have just heard about this and have joined us for the first time. You are all very welcome. There are lots and lots of really great talks and interviews and bits and bobs about military history that are currently doing the rounds on the internet. A lot of people are taking the time and trouble to post all sorts of interesting content. So I thought, what could I do that could be something short and sweet that I could just do in the space of 10 or 15 minutes that hopefully tell you something that you didn't already know. So I thought I'd start with a talk about the VTC and the volunteer regiments, the First World War Home Guard, if you like. It's something that most people know a little bit about, but not a lot, and very often what they do know is actually not really that accurate. So right at the start, when the war breaks out in August 1914, all over the country people are setting up their own little volunteer units for home defence, with no organisation at all. There's no central organisation to it, and that's a real problem for the War Office because, needless to say, it's dragging off all sorts of people that they really want to recruit into the regular army and the navy. So the War Office invite the Central Association of the VTC, the Volunteer Training Corps, which had existed since 1910. They give them the job of trying to coordinate, trying to bring all of those disparate organisations under one roof and into the same organisation. So the Central Association go out to the various associations and say to them, look, would you like to join the Central Association, the VTC? Because if you don't, you're going to have to disband. So right from the outset, all sorts of these separate organisations gradually get brought under one roof and into one kind of organisation. It's not popular with the War Office at all. They've got far too many other things going on. They're really not in the slightest bit interested in volunteers. They've already got a massive job on their hands trying to equip and feed and accommodate and dress all the new armies. So the very idea of trying to help out the volunteers at all is right at the very back of their minds. A situation not helped by the fact that Kitchener absolutely detests the volunteers and the volunteer movement and everything to do with it, and every time he makes a speech he pretty much rubbishes all of their efforts and tells them pretty much not to bother. And really the VTC, I suppose it's true to say really that the VTC don't really get a fair crack at the whip until after Kitchener was drowned in 1916. So right at the outset, the War Office do set some rules and regulations. They say that the VTC can't have standard British Army ranks, so they all have their own rank structure, and they absolutely can't have khaki wool uniforms because all of the khaki dye, all of the wool fabric is needed for the Army and obviously the wool for the Navy. So the permission that they have, the uniforms that they grant permission for, are a kind of khaki greeny grey sort of coloured cotton, waterproof cotton like this one here. The instruction says that they're to be Norfolk jackets, which obviously that one is with its double button belt at the front there, but there was no pattern. So even though 4 pocket jackets were the most common, you see them with 2 top pockets or you see them with 2 skirt pockets, all sorts of weird and wonderful designs, some of them with matching trousers or breeches, some with corduroy breeches, some with leather gaiters, some with greeny grey puttees, and obviously the caps to match. From the outset, all sorts of badges. Everybody came up with their own designs for badges. There was a specific VTC badge, a sort of a main VTC design, which this is, which certainly Suffolk VTC adopted. So the basic design with a scroll underneath which just says Suffolk. But apart from that, in terms of the equipment, it was pretty much make, do and mend, whatever you could get hold of. So there's all sorts of ancient stuff pressed into service, or civilian waist belts, weaponry, shotguns, pikes. I mean, from that point of view, very similar to the Home Guard a generation later, but pretty disorganised. All the members of the VTC had a red armband, this 5-inch wide red armband with a black GR on, obviously George Rex, for the King, but it gave rise to the nickname the Gorgeous Rex, which was the sort of, they were stuck with pretty much for the duration of their time in the VTC. And that armband was to be worn whether you were in uniform or when you were in civvies, when you were going to work every day in civvies. So that was something that obviously they were quite proud of. It was something that it was their bit of uniform, if you like. And time and time again, the Central Association, the VTC, would go to the War Office and say, look, can we become formal part of your organisation? We really want to be part of it. And time again, they were not backed by the War Office. And again, as I say, not helped by the fact that Kitchener really didn't like the volunteer movement at all, to the point where every time Kitchener made a major speech about the volunteers, huge numbers left. In fact, in some instances, some of the actual volunteer companies themselves literally shut down because of, well, actually, if the Minister for War doesn't want us, why are we bothering? However, they did stick with it, and as I say, after Kitchener's death, they were given the opportunity to expand and get better kit. And actually, it's in May 1916, in actual fact, that they are finally, if you like, taken on board as part of the War Office at long last, as part of the War Office organisation. They're allowed to use proper military ranks instead of the sort of the previous VTC ranks, although specifically the actual rank badges had to be a special greeny grey colour. They weren't in theory allowed to use the proper military ones. The London branches of the VTC, several of those did wear khaki uniforms. They'd already bought them before the initial order had come out that said they weren't allowed to, and they were like, well, stuff it, we're either going to carry on wearing these or we'll pack it up. So they were allowed to carry on. When the decision was finally made that they were allowed to wear proper uniforms, they still weren't allowed to wear the standard khaki serge uniform or drab uniform. They had to have what was called volunteer green, which is this. It's a much lighter weight than the proper fabric worn by the rest of the army, in this very greeny blue colour. And at this time, their armbands were different. This time they were a khaki armband, a narrow khaki armband with a red crown on, with the G and the R either side. And on the back, they had to write their name and their number. In this case, we've got 7255 GW 3rd F Company 1st Battalion Suffolk Volunteer Regiment written on the inside. So that was, so that they nearly always, when you find these issued ones, have always got their names and numbers in them. Not to be confused with the Derby Scheme armband, and you can see why a lot of people do confuse them, or a lot of people think these were part of the Derby Scheme. Derby Scheme in 1915, for all those men who'd volunteered and said that they were prepared to serve in the army, but not yet. So you got yourself a Derby Scheme armband, and you were then allowed to carry on with your civilian life until you were called up, at what point when the army needed you. A lot of Derby Scheme men were taken into the VTC. A lot of them served with the VTC until they were ready, and there are some instances of them wearing the two armbands together. But that's a Derby Scheme armband, and that is the Volunteer Regiment one. Because at the point when they do get taken into the War Office, they officially cease to be the VTC. The Volunteer Training Corps stops in mid-1916, and they become volunteer regiments. So in the case of the Suffolk Regiment there, the 1st Battalion, the 1st Suffolk Volunteer Regiment. Now, there was a lot of disappointment to begin with, because they weren't part of the county regiments. So the 1st Suffolk Volunteer Regiment had nothing to do with the Suffolk Regiment at all, and they weren't allowed to wear their badges. Although curiously and very unusually, there are photographs of men of the VTC, the earlier VTC, very clearly wearing Suffolk Regiment cap badges in 1915, so a bit of an anomaly there. However, when the volunteer regiments came into being, all of those old VTC cap badges and all the weird and wonderful stuff that all the different counties had got all disappear, and they are replaced with this large coat of arms. Exactly the same badge that earlier had been worn by the Labour Corps when that was first instituted, although by the end of the war Labour Corps had got their own. But this large coat of arms, this large crest of arms, was specifically the badge of the volunteer regiments. Towards the end of the war, right at the end of the war, in July 1918, at that point, they are formally allowed to be affiliated to the regiments, which actually was quite an honour for them. But up until that point, whenever you come across a volunteer regiment tunic, very often the shoulder titles are embroidered in off-white on a piece of khaki, and it'll be a white V over what appears to be the county title. But they actually weren't counties, they were Lord Lieutenancies, because the volunteer regiments were raised under Lord Lieutenants. So it was the Lord Lieutenancy, so hence the fact you have some which were V Rutland, and obviously then V Suffolk, V Norfolk, etc. So Lord Lieutenancies were for the regiments until right at the end of the war, where even though they continued to wear the V Suffolk or V Norfolk, at that point they did become part of the regiments, which was, as I say, was quite an honour for these guys that really throughout the war had doggedly kept kept volunteering all the way through. In the last few months of the war, really after the sort of the big German March offensive in 1918, when there was a serious lack of manpower at the army, let alone munitions work and everything else, some men were allowed to volunteer to do coastal defence duties. And there are some cracking accounts of men who were farm labourers or whatever, who then found themselves effectively joined to a coastal artillery battery or whatever for a couple of months. And despite the fact that they were just volunteers, they found themselves joining regular army units or territorial army units on coastal defence. The final uniform here is the tunic of the Reverend Marriott. Now, Reverend Marriott had served in the 2nd Volunteer Battalion Suffolk Regiment in the 1890s. In 1899, he'd volunteered for the volunteer company to go to South Africa with the Suffolk Regiment, and went with all the men of the volunteer companies from the different 1st Volunteer Battalion, 2nd, 3rd, and he'd gone to South Africa, hence his Queen South Africa ribbon. After the war, had become a priest in Eye and lived at Wilby Rectory, and he got very heavily involved in the volunteer movement. And by the end of the war, he was the commandant of half of the Suffolk Volunteer Regiments. So in terms of the organisation, the honorary commandant was Sir Courtney Warner, who was the Lord Lieutenant. The county commandant was the Earl Cadogan, and then there were two separate commandantures of 3 battalions each, and the Reverend Marriott was in charge of the B echelon, basically the 2nd group of those. And what's very unusual about his tunic is the staff tabs in brown were specifically staff officer of the volunteer movement, which is a very, very unusual thing indeed. And when this turned up in auction a few years ago, there was tons and tons of paperwork in the pockets, including all of these mid-Suffolk light railway tickets from him going from Stradbroke to the drill hall in Ipswich, on Woodbridge Road in Ipswich, funny enough, basically on volunteer regiment business. But it seemed that he didn't file anything, he just kept it all in his pockets. So finally, just as I say, an awful lot of officialdom with the VTC. There was a lot of organisation behind the scene. It might have seemed disorganised because, as I say, they didn't have, there wasn't a standardised uniform, there wasn't standardised weapons, but the actual regulations were standardised. The official regulations for the Volunteer Training Corps were published in 1915, and likewise there's a similar publication for the volunteer regiments. And so by the end of the war, what had started as a very disparate, very disorganised crowd, who at times had been, really downhearted, especially by the way that they'd been treated by Kitchener amongst others, and the War Office in particular, had stuck it right to the end and become something that really those members were very proud to belong to, and that accolade at the end where they were allowed to be affiliated to their local county regiments was really the sort of final honour for them. So a story that's very rarely told. By the end, there's probably 250,000 men had served in the Volunteer Training Corps by the end of the war, which is a significant number. A lot of men who would then go on to join the services, but an awful lot of them who were too old, who were too young, who were not fit enough, or in reserved occupations. And whilst we always think about the Home Guard in the Second World War, the Home Guard, if you like, in the First World War, very rarely get a mention. So next time you see any mention of the VTC or the First War Volunteers, spare a thought for them. Thank you very much, and we will see you hopefully next month.